A deployment that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the calculus of this war. Hours that sent shockwaves through Moscow's military command. Hours that proved Ukraine has been saving something devastating for exactly the right moment. What Kyiv did tonight crossed a line that the Kremlin had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Russia did not have time to respond. They were caught with precision, with overwhelming force, and with a level of coordination that suggests months of meticulous planning had finally come to fruition. The weapon Ukraine waited months to receive, months to integrate, months to train on, was deployed tonight, and the results are still being assessed across multiple intelligence agencies from Washington to London to Berlin. This is not speculation, this is not rumor, this is confirmed. And what we're about to break down for you represents one of the most significant tactical shifts we've witnessed since the full-scale invasion began. For several months now, there had been signals, not official briefings, not public announcements, just signals that Ukraine was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been resilient, yes, but they have been calculated in their resilience. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a predictability that allowed analysts to anticipate their next steps. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and across NATO headquarters this week was that the rhythm went silent. Defense analysts who monitor Ukrainian military communications know the indicators, the positioning of specific units near strategic corridors, the subtle increase in reconnaissance drone activity over key Russian positions, the unusual patterns in Western military aid delivery schedules. The sudden reduction in Ukrainian offensive statements to the press, all of that went quiet. And whenever Ukraine goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For context, Ukraine received authorization to use certain long-range Western weapon systems back in early spring. But authorization is not the same as deployment. Integration takes time, training takes time, and most importantly, target acquisition and strategic timing take time. What we now know is that Ukraine spent those months not just preparing the weapons, they were preparing the entire operational framework around them. They were identifying targets. They were mapping Russian air defense networks. They were coordinating with Western intelligence on real-time satellite data. They were rehearsing strike packages that would maximize destruction while minimizing the risk of interception. And tonight, all of that preparation paid off. The silence broke. And Moscow is still trying to figure out what just hit them. Early this evening, Pentagon sources detected what they described as multiple simultaneous launch signatures from Ukrainian-controlled territory, including missile trajectories that had not been observed in over 14 months of conflict monitoring. These are the kinds of strike profiles that Ukraine only executes when they are signaling something very specific: strategic escalation, operational breakthrough, or a fundamental shift in how they intend to prosecute this war. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Ukraine was changing its posture. And when a nation at war shifts posture without prior diplomatic signaling, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency in the Western alliance pays attention. The weapons in question, and we can now confirm this based on multiple corroborating sources, were the long-range ATACMS missiles that the United States had been reluctant to provide for over a year. These are not ordinary artillery rockets. These are precision-guided ballistic missiles with a range exceeding 300 kilometers, capable of striking deep into Russian-held territory and even across the internationally recognized Russian border itself. For months, Ukraine pleaded for these weapons. For months, Washington hesitated, fearing escalation. For months, the Kremlin warned of catastrophic consequences if these systems were ever deployed against Russian forces. Tonight, all of that debate became academic, because tonight Ukraine used them, and they didn't just use them. They used them in a coordinated strike package that demonstrated a level of sophistication that even some Western military planners didn't expect. The statement issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Ukraine's strike as strategically significant, operationally precise, and perhaps most importantly, a clear demonstration that Ukraine is no longer playing defense, but Russian deterrence only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most aggressive and coordinated offensive actions we've seen since the Kharkiv counteroffensive in September 2022. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of the initial launch detection, Ukrainian forces struck multiple high-value Russian targets simultaneously across occupied Ukrainian territory, and, according to unconfirmed reports, at least 2 locations inside Russia itself. These weren't the standard HIMARS strikes we've become accustomed to seeing. These were ATACMS, the weapons that Russian military doctrine explicitly warned would be treated as a direct attack by NATO itself, and Ukraine deployed them knowing full well what that rhetoric meant. They deployed them anyway. Because after months of waiting, after months of watching Russian forces entrench and fortify, after months of incremental gains that cost thousands of Ukrainian lives, Kyiv made a decision. The time for restraint was over. Tonight, satellite imagery confirmed that Ukraine launched precision strikes on at least 7 confirmed Russian positions, including a major logistics hub near Mariupol that had recently been converted into a forward ammunition depot for what analysts believe was a planned winter offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could move those supplies forward. They hit the depot itself. They hit the rail lines feeding into it. They hit the command and control facility coordinating distribution. They hit the air defense batteries that were supposed to protect all of it. In other words, Ukraine targeted the entire logistical chain, not just one link, the infrastructure that would have made the Russian offensive operational. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Russia's positioning wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of force concentration that could have broken through Ukrainian lines in the Zaporizhia sector if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian infrastructure. They didn't target population centers. They hit military logistics. They hit command nodes. They hit the machinery of war itself, and the precision was remarkable. Initial battle damage assessments suggest that over 80% of the targeted facilities sustained critical damage. That's an interception failure rate that should terrify Russian air defense commanders, because if Ukraine can achieve that level of success with ATACMS tonight, they can do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations in Ukraine collapses entirely. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's recent military posturing was designed to test the resolve of Western support for Ukraine after months of political uncertainty in Washington and growing war fatigue across Europe. Moscow wanted to see whether Ukraine would be constrained by its Western partners, whether the weapons would remain symbolic, locked in warehouses, never actually used against Russian forces in meaningful ways. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate. They launched a strike package that was so precise, so devastating, that even Russia's military command structure noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, Kyiv did. Senior defense officials speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's recent force buildup as a pressure campaign, a way to test NATO's commitment while positioning for potential negotiations. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defenses had less than 3 minutes of warning before impact. That timing matters because it shows something critical about Ukraine's intelligence capabilities. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian movements. They are anticipating them. They are inside Russia's decision-making loop. And that changes everything about how this war will unfold in the coming weeks. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian ground forces carried out coordinated artillery barrages along 3 separate fronts, forcing Russian units to disperse and abandon prepared positions. Ukrainian special operations teams targeted communication relays that had been upgraded in the last 72 hours, suggesting real-time intelligence was guiding their target selection. Ukrainian drone units operating behind Russian lines reportedly destroyed fuel depots used by Russia to sustain armored operations in the Donbas. This wasn't just a missile strike. This wasn't just a show of force. This was strategic synchronization. This was operational tempo, and operational tempo is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed push on Kyiv in February 2022. For every kilometer of ground they have gained, Ukraine has countered with something that erodes their ability to hold it. Tonight was the most dramatic example of that pattern yet. But it won't be the last. Because what Ukraine demonstrated tonight is that they now possess the tools to strike Russian forces anywhere in the theater of operations, and possibly beyond. Remember, Russia thought the ATACMS would never arrive. They thought Washington's hesitation was permanent. They thought the political divisions in the United States would prevent any meaningful escalation of support. They thought Ukraine would eventually exhaust itself, grinding down in a war of attrition that favored Russian manpower and industrial capacity. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The weapons arrived, the training was completed, the integration was seamless, and the strikes were devastating. Russia built its entire winter strategy around the assumption that Ukraine would remain constrained by Western risk aversion. That assumption just evaporated, and the Kremlin now faces a reality they spent months trying to prevent. Ukraine has the capability to strike Russian forces with impunity and the political backing to do so without restriction. This is not the war Russia planned for. This is not the calculus Putin expected. And this is certainly not the outcome that Russian military planners briefed to the Kremlin just weeks ago. Everything has changed. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Russia's latest military buildup happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense internal pressure. Russian military hardliners want total mobilization and escalation to tactical nuclear threats. Russian oligarchs want the sanctions lifted and some path back to economic normalcy. Russian nationalists want territorial gains that justify the massive casualties Russia has sustained. Russian pragmatists want a negotiated settlement that preserves what gains have been made. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing a war that has cost over 300,000 Russian casualties and destroyed Russia's reputation as a conventional military power. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The winter offensive Russia was planning wasn't just about territory, it was about demonstrating to Putin's domestic critics that the war could still be won. Tonight, Ukraine took that narrative away from him. They struck the preparations for that offensive before it could launch. They demonstrated that Russia cannot mass forces without those forces being destroyed. And they sent a message to every faction inside Russia that this war is far from the victory Putin promised. The Pentagon statement, now being circulated across every major Western government, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to see Russia achieve its military objectives through escalation. Officials said plainly that Russia's force concentration was inconsistent with any path toward peaceful resolution. That is diplomatic language for, "We see what you're doing, and we've authorized Ukraine to stop you." You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. And tonight, something serious is absolutely at stake. The next several weeks will determine whether Russia can sustain offensive operations into 2025 or whether Ukraine has just shattered their ability to do so. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte issued a parallel statement describing the alliance's unwavering commitment to Ukraine's defense and sovereignty. The British Foreign Office released a statement supporting Ukraine's right to strike legitimate military targets wherever they are located. And the European Union's foreign policy chief described tonight's events as a turning point in the conflict. These are not empty words. These are coordinated signals, and Russia is hearing every single one of them. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a brief, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We waited for these weapons because we knew they would change the battlefield. Tonight, they did." He said, "Every Russian soldier on Ukrainian soil should understand there is no safe position, there is no protected depot, there is no hidden command post. We will find them all." And he said, "This is not escalation, this is liberation, and we will not stop until every occupied kilometer is returned to Ukraine." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who is willing to accept the risks that come with decisive action. Zelensky has been cautious throughout this war. He has balanced Western concerns with Ukrainian military realities. He has avoided actions that might fracture the coalition supporting his country. But tonight, he made clear that caution has its limits, and those limits have been reached. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's military positioning wasn't isolated. Along with the troop concentrations near Zaporizhzhia, Russian naval forces also repositioned in the Black Sea, moving missile-capable vessels closer to Ukrainian coastal infrastructure. Russian strategic bombers conducted unusual flight patterns near the Arctic that Baltic air defense networks tracked with heightened concern. Russian cyber operations increased their targeting of Ukrainian power grid infrastructure, suggesting preparation for coordinated winter attacks on civilian energy systems. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means Moscow was preparing a coordinated winter campaign designed to break Ukrainian resistance before Western political cycles shift in 2025, but Ukraine struck first, and by striking first, they may have disrupted the entire timeline Russia was operating on. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing to escalate beyond conventional weapons in response to tonight's strikes, potentially with tactical nuclear threats or direct attacks on NATO logistics hubs. Another is that Russia is attempting to draw Ukraine into a broader conflict that would strain Western support, betting that European publics will lose patience with escalation. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to provoke NATO into a direct response, creating a justification for full mobilization and wartime economic measures that Putin has avoided implementing. But today, Ukraine took the escalation card off the table. They didn't wait for Russia to attack. They didn't allow the initiative to shift to Moscow. They didn't let Putin dictate the tempo of this war. They struck decisively, comprehensively, and with devastating effectiveness. And now Russia must respond, not from a position of strength, but from a position of disruption. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine can sustain this level of offensive pressure, or whether tonight was an isolated capability demonstration. Ukraine wants to show that the weapons they waited months to receive have transformed their ability to wage this war. NATO wants to prevent any Russian escalation that might draw the alliance into direct conflict. And the world wants to prevent the catastrophic consequences that would follow if this conflict spirals beyond its current boundaries. The next 48 hours will be critical. Russia will respond. The only question is how. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian command and control frequencies for any indication of how Moscow will react. They say Russian military communications have surged dramatically in the last 3 hours, consistent with emergency command consultations. They say Russian air defense networks across occupied territory have shifted to heightened alert status. And they say Russia's decision to concentrate forces near Zaporizhia is likely part of a broader strategic framework intended to achieve breakthrough gains before Western support potentially shifts in the new year. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is pressing the advantage. Their response today, precise, coordinated, and overwhelming, sent a message to Russia that the rules of this war have changed. And it sent a message to the West that the weapons they provided are being used effectively, responsibly, and to devastating effect. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with their winter offensive preparations. But what we do know is that Ukraine's strike was timely. It disrupted Russian logistics before those logistics could sustain an offensive. It demonstrated Ukrainian capabilities that Russia clearly underestimated, and it restored momentum to a conflict that many observers feared was settling into frozen stalemate. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as the turning point when Ukraine seized the initiative and never relinquished it. If they escalate, Ukraine and its Western partners have already shown they are prepared for that contingency. They have shown they are ready to respond, and they have shown that the resolve backing Ukraine is stronger than Moscow calculated. And tonight, for the first time in months, Russia appears to be off balance. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after a strategic setback, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they should have learned long ago. That Ukraine will not wait to be attacked, that the weapons the West provides will be used, and that every Russian calculation about this war has been fundamentally wrong. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine has changed the game. Russia is reeling, and the world is watching to see what happens next. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.